I'd like to call upon architect Serina Hijjas of Hijjas Architects and Planner to come onto the stage to give us her presentation. And the topic is the lightness of being. And what I would like to do is have a little bit of intro as to who our first guest speaker is, although I'm sure it's not necessary, but nevertheless, protocol. Serina Hijjas is the director of Hijjas Custody Associates and has more than 20 years of experience in architectural planning and design. For Kuala Lumpur Architecture Festival, Serina presents the Malaysian Pavilion at Expo 2020 in Dubai, currently running until March 31 by Hijjas Architects, and with an eloquent vision in timber design with net zero carbon in mind. The client, Malaysia Green Technology and Climate Change Centre, had in the competition pursued the core theme of energizing sustainability, and of course from there, Serina and the team created a narrative of a canopy of trees. Before we formally invite her on stage, we would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate her recently for receiving an honorary doctorate for the contribution towards the built environment here in Malaysia. So let's give her a round of applause for that as well. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for those of us who are heartbroken that we might not be able to go to Dubai this year for the Expo, this is the next best thing. Please welcome architect Serina Hijjas on the topic of today's event, the lightness of being. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to take off my mask and speak. I'm kind of sweating quite a lot underneath this. So I've wiped everything and I'll keep away from everybody. I've also kept away from my sister who got COVID last week, Monday. I don't live with her, so that's all okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. And I don't know where the lightness of being topic came, but you'll see that actually our concept for the building was not lightness of being, but touching the ground lightly. It was something that I heard in a talk by Glenn Murcutt from Australia. Anybody who knows the work of Glenn Murcutt, it's very light and it's very adaptive to the location, and his sense of materiality is second to none. And so that idea of touching the ground lightly was probably something that it gets stuck in your mind, and then you think about it, and then when an opportunity comes, you bring it to mind. I think I better do the checker. Yeah, thanks. Oh, we're at the last slide. We're going backwards. So it's the first time we're doing the control from over there. Usually I'm just behind the laptop. We seem to be going backwards. So a little bit about the Malaysia Pavilion is that so our concept was touching the ground lightly. And I think most of you who've been in architecture school sort of have seen these kind of images of the World Expo. And one of the earliest is essentially New York's World Fair, 1939. It's all about big architecture. It's all about architecture of the future. And the opportunities of each expo is basically for every country to show what is their best look on the future. One of the themes that keeps coming up whenever we think about the expo is this idea that it's not permanent. It's an architecture of non-permanence. It's transitory. And I think if you know about Malaysian architecture, the old kampong houses, some of them can be moved. Also at architecture school, I remember this image of people sort of carrying a building across the yard in this kind of manner. It's called usang rumah, or moving house. So when you're thinking about temporary architecture, just think about the past and what we used to do. We used to lift up the buildings if we needed to move it. Or if it's 100 years old, you take it all apart and you reassemble it, like what he just did at Rimbundahan, took apart a house that was 100 years old and reassembled it in Rimbundahan. So this idea that you can deconstruct and reconstruct the building, I think it's really something that we should think about in terms of the future. We were very lucky at the Milan Expo to have participated in that. And for the very, very first time, Malaysia was able to express itself beyond a Minangkabau roof. If you know, all the other pieces of Expo buildings have always been a Minangkabau roof, and it symbolized Malaysia. And for the very first time, what we wanted is to create something that was more about the essence about Malaysia and also about what we feel is the future of Malaysia. And in this expo, it was about the idea that we could assemble the piece of architecture and disassemble it and bring it home. Unfortunately, it was more expensive to bring it home than to leave it there. And in this building, this idea was using timber, but the concept for this was the seeds of the rainforest. And the theme for that at that date was basically feeding the planet. So every time you think about the expo, you have to actually match the concept to your building. In the Dubai Expo, it was a totally different experience. For those of you who still want to go to the expo, it's another 30 days. I really say that it's a great opportunity to go and see the different types of pavilions at the expo. Malaysia Pavilion being, and it looks rather large here, is actually one of the smallest pavilions in the whole of Expo. But what we wanted to do was give the most impact in terms of the statement that we wanted to make. There are about a few timber pavilions in Expo. On the left, you see the Polish pavilion, which is also all in timber. On the right, you see the Sweden. You'll see some similarities of columns like what we also have for the Malaysian Pavilion, and you see what is the narrative to the concept of the columns that we have for our pavilion. In Sweden, it's complete timber that was brought there and a complete timber rafter that was brought there. And they brought all the timber craftsmen from Malaysia, from Sweden to build that. We unfortunately didn't do that. Maybe in Osaka, when you will have the opportunity to basically participate and compete for the ideas for the Malaysia Pavilion there. So for the Dubai Expo, it was the rainforest canopy. Dubai Expo has this theme, and that is connecting minds and creating the future through opportunity, mobility, and sustainability. That was the theme given for the Dubai Expo in 2019 when we actually participated in the competition. Malaysia Pavilion theme statement from MGTC, from the government, was energizing today, tomorrow, harmony and business. And our theme was to connect all that through the synergy with nature, to connect the Expo's theme as well as MGTC's theme to the pavilion concept of synergy with nature. And some of the themes that runs through that and through this presentation, what you're seeing is the exact presentation we presented when we actually gave the ideas for the theme. One is balancing our energy systems, where we saw the future is about balancing our energy systems. It's about addressing this issue that Malaysia was always being criticized for, which is the reforestation, and that we actually are doing restoration for our forests. And we also have a cap to the minimum amount of forest that we are maintaining. It's about balancing sustainable plantation. We had a lot of criticism at the very time we were doing the competition about palm plantation. And so the building had to talk about sustainable plantation, which you will see the narratives in the themes inside the exhibition. And the concept of touching the ground lightly was basically taking something of our Malaysian tradition of building on stilts and building with timber. So this was the concept that drove our design. And the idea of being something a bit more playful, which is in the canopy of trees, this idea that you're doing exploration as you're walking through and jumping from one canopy to the other, was also something that we thought would bring delight to the experience in the building. So, and this was the idea for the rainforest canopy, that we elevate the entire building. Touching the ground lightly was not just that we lifted it off the ground, but that the impact of this building, which then became the first net zero carbon building for the entire Expo, despite being the smallest pavilion, had the loudest voice to speak about approaching net zero, which has become a real theme for this last 2 years in the pandemic, almost every talk that you attend to is talking about net zero. Everyone's talking about sustainable nature-based design and all the rest of it, but we were already talking about it, and we wanted Malaysia to represent that and become an inspiration for Malaysia, but also globally. In terms of the design methodology, usually what you see in terms of exhibition buildings is it's one contained building and it's the experience of the black blocks going inside that exhibition. We wanted to change that. We talked about stacking, we talked about landscape, we talked about mimicking a tree canopy. And so you can see the evolution of how the design started to take its place in the formation of the building itself. And in the end, what you see is something that's fairly organic, and you see a lot of as much trees that can be covered in between it. But you see this meandering experience to get up there. There's always this huge line to get into Expo, and we wanted that entire experience to be part of the experience of going into the building. And this idea of a meandering river path, basically, to experience going into the pavilion is that you're meandering up the ramp and into the building itself as part of the experience. So in terms of a spatial flow, we had to consider exhibition flow. It's incredible when you're doing one of these expos because the brief that comes to you from Expo is about this thick. It covers every element of sustainability. I think this is the first Expo that basically required that every pavilion had to report about the sustainability of their buildings. This is the meandering experience that you go up. Right at the front there, we have a water collection pond, a biofield right in front, and then you enter and you ramp up and experience through what you often see when you go into the Instagram of the Expo Malaysia is that they use this amphitheater, which is open to the public. So they have a lot of shows. Currently, they have about 820,000 people that have come to this tiny little pavilion itself. And they're aiming and they hope that they will reach 1 million by the end of March, which is incredible when you see the small exhibition spaces that you actually have to go into the space itself. So you'll meander through a garden, water feature, amphitheater, and all the way up past the cafeteria and public space and enter really from the rear of the building. The idea of using timber was also to do with carbon, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But as you can see, we just wanted to give something that was very, very light. Meranti timber is what we use for the timber, PEFC rated, of course, and that was the only element we brought from Malaysia. Everything else we actually built in Dubai itself. This is the tiny site. It's very, very long. So trying to create an experience from the journey, from the time you enter and the journey into the whole experience is rather important. We had hoped that we actually, and we've told MGTC the next time that you get a site, please try and make sure you got a much bigger frontage. But a very narrow site is an interesting thing about how do you create an impact when you enter into the pavilion. This was our first perspective, and then you'll see what the finish actually looks like. It looks quite close to what this building looks like here, and you'll understand the story about why we inserted these metal columns. I think after we finished and we saw the Sweden, we'd never seen the Sweden design at the time we designed this, but when we actually went to Expo and saw their timber, we half wish we put timber here. So the walkthrough experience is just as important as the building on the first impact that you see. And so you see some of the images of what was our inspiration, and then you see some of the exhibition down below. When doing the visitor flow for this, as you can see, we suspended the building, or what appears to be suspended at the top, but we still also have a basement in the building, and we bring daylight in through the courtyards on the sides to bring daylight into that space. And that's because even though it was a small site, the client actually required so much that they wanted to do here. They run activities every week. They run engagement, they run business to business, they bring all the ministries. And so it really is very, very eventful. I think even more so than Milan was. So all the exhibition is at the top, and the theming that you can see here at the top there is Energizing Tomorrow, which is at the topmost floor, Energizing Today, which is all about where we are, Energizing Harmony is all about the public interface, and Energizing Business is down below. In terms of plan, it's a very, very organic plan. On entering, we called it Canopy 1, Canopy 2, Canopy 3, Canopy 4, and they tell a narrative about each aspect about Malaysia. One is about reforestation, one is about cluster plantation, one is about regrowth. At the end, you'll see there's a cube there that's about quintessence. All the concepts for the interior and the concept for the exhibition was also generated by ourselves before we actually get an ID to work with us in terms of that. In fact, we completed everything ourselves with regards to the story. So on entering, you have what we call Reforestation Exhibition, and that's an immersive experience about the reforestation. And you can see this was our image for that experience inside there. And this is the final. So it's not too far away from each other. I think you can see that. This is an animation story talking about the whole rainforest and the contribution to Malaysia in terms of the rainforest. The second was about cluster plantation, and it's a little bit more, it looks a little bit more high tech, and we didn't want to do the sort of typical exhibition about plantations and how much planting and all the rest of it. It really is a sort of an LAD tree in that way, and cluster plantation, and this is the exhibition in that space itself, which is a sort of moving exhibition with the descriptions down below happening. So this is the experience that you get going there. So I tried to put in some visuals. These are from Chun is the project architect. She's here. So thank you very much for coming. Seen this quite a few times, but these are all images that we have all taken as we walk through just to see what we designed and what we completed was exactly the same. This is a story about regrowth. And in regrowth, as you can see, it's about the future, what Malaysia is planning. And this is the space itself going through there. And at the end of that layer of exhibition on the first floor, we call this Quintessence Exhibition, which is actually sponsored by Petronas. I know there may be comments about Petronas and oil and sustainability, but the story here is of Petronas actually making the right moves towards sustainability. This is the experience inside the exhibition, and we'll just play a little bit here just to show you. It's a circular space with a cube, LED cube inside there, and there's a narration for about 5 short minutes whilst you walk around telling you the experience inside. One of the best things about going to Expo is going in to see all the other exhibitions and all the other pavilions. It is quite incredible. Everything from the Foster's mobility to the opportunity on the other side is just quite an amazing experience. Next. Oops, back, sorry. But the experience of creating a pavilion is also about the experience of the outside. And so in that journey and the nighttime, the poles itself are a symbol of trees, actually. That's the idea of the poles on the outside. If you were to take that away, it would feel quite empty. It's also to frame the building. But on these light poles, we have little LED lights that are representing the fireflies. We presented this to the then Minister for Energy, which was Yo Being. And one of the first things that she wanted to see was this idea of the firefly. And we incorporated this idea of the firefly when we had presented to her. But on the underbellies of the pavilion itself, we have these global reflections that are actually happening and exhibiting and lighting at night. So it's fairly dynamic. You see some sort of green verticals, columns that are going up there inside, and that's the view at night of the pavilion. That's the views of the lights around. And actually we are right at the end also of one of the streets of the Expo, unlike Milan, where we were in the middle, where you start from one end and you finish on the other end. In this case, there are 3 branches representing opportunity, mobility for themes of Expo. And we were at the end of one of the subsections. So the poles actually help us to be seen from a distance, which was actually quite a help. So we all know that the planet is in crisis, and so what can we do about that? And so we made a very conscious effort in terms of how we were going to build this pavilion, always from the idea of the Usang Rumah, what can we do? And we then presented, which obviously the government was quite excited about, advancing the net zero carbon and then the net zero energy. And net zero energy only came beforehand because after we finished, because Dubai basically gave REC solar to the entire Expo site. So the entire Expo site has done a replacement with Dewa's REC solar to cover the entire site. Just to talk about embodied carbon and operational carbon. This is something that you're going to have to start to talk about. We've been always talking about energy efficiency and green buildings and all the rest of it. The next big shift for all of us to start thinking about is net zero and embodied and operational carbon. And embodied for a building usually is only about 10% for that building's life cycle of 20 years. The operational is about 28% of the carbon that it gives, because we contribute 38% in the building industry to carbon, the global carbon CO2. But in the case of a pavilion where the life cycle is only 6 months, the embodied may actually be more than the operational. And what do we do with the pavilion building after that? So we build in concrete, metal, glass, and now in wood. More and more we're seeing in the construction of wood coming in, and that's because of the low embodied carbon associated with wood. Materials we use for building, we need to now consider these things as we start to move forward. And of course, in the building, we actually had put solar PV as much as possible on the roof. We have heli fans on 2 sides to actually have air movement going around the building. It is obviously self-shading in the areas down below. So there were various things you can do right at the onset when you're designing the building. This is one of the final renders, and these are some of the perspective views of the building itself. So I hope the sort of concept and the end product sort of matches itself. And in this case, the building itself, we started to talk about the tonnage of materials used for every sector. So we actually did an embodied carbon calculation at the beginning and submitted that as our sustainable report to Expo. At the end, which will be next month, we will be looking at the final operational. Now, the operational here, the highest value is the AV. We've just discovered that after doing all the calculations. Chun will tell you that the highest thing is actually the AV experience, because you're doing all that. Now, not all pavilions give you that whole AV experience. There are some of those who just give a sort of more natural feel as you're going through, but most of them basically come with the sort of animation and all the rest that you see. So what did we do for the embodied carbon? We use lightweight structure. All the floors here are not concrete floors. All the floors here are marine ply floors. So everything is in timber. Thank you, Sika. We have that on our roof. It's the only thing that we want to prescribe for roofs for waterproofing. So just to let you know, that's just a coincidence. But just to let you know that you have sponsored, not sponsored, we have paid for it, but it's on the roof here, Sika Sanaville. Sustainable timber facade, flooring. So floor, walls, all of that is in timber except for the basement, which had to be done in concrete. But even there, we use fly ash in the base. Steel structure to be recycled. 75% of all the materials, when we take this building down, is going to be recycled. And that's what we mean about the life cycle. Deployment and decommissioning. And the land has to be returned to ground zero. At the moment, the Malaysian government is talking about a legacy program. Expo has picked this pavilion as one of the pavilions to be the legacy, which means it can stand for another 5 years, which is one of the first time, which is a wonderful thing. But we haven't got confirmation just yet whether we will be taking the legacy or not. 10% in terms of PV on our roof was already given. We didn't know we were going to get free rack from Dewa. Energy efficiency already dropped to 25.7. Portable water in the desert is not a very easy thing to do. And certainly the amount of planting both Singapore and Malaysia had done is quite a feat to look at the portable water reduction. And then, of course, the renewable energy that we spoke about. Being the first net zero carbon has been a great windfall for Malaysia, representing that this is the direction to go. And what does that equate to? And the tonnages, we actually had to work all those out. We will obviously be re-looking at the operational energy, but Malaysia has already purchased tree planting, specifically in return for some of the tonnages of GHG that we are emitting. And we actually have bought even more. I think just as a ratio for you to build, solar energy can only cover 1:2 proportion of your roof coverage to your floor area, and it's only covering your day use. So if you wanted to get to a zero or net zero or neutrality, it's really quite tough. I just wanted to give you some of the information that was developed during the time of the construction and the pavilion itself, and what other pavilions are doing. So I think you can guess which pavilion in which country without me telling you. It's got the stars and stripes. And that's because they're motivated by the idea of going to Mars. We are motivated by the natural environment. And so building for transients is a totally different type of construction and thinking. And at the end, we have to actually return it exactly to this. We have to return it to ground zero. This is the first picture. There's Chun on the right there. There's our client in the middle. This was the first time we put all the scaffolding up. When the land is given by the government, so when you go to Osaka, good luck to everybody else who's going to be entering that competition. But you have to return the ground to exactly the way you found it. The wonderful thing about the Expo site, before everybody talks about the waste and all the rest of it, is quite a lot of the pavilions are being purchased, but also the site has a legacy program, and they're actually turning it to residential as soon as this is completed. Residential, institutional, a park, and all the rest of it. So that planning was already done years ago and will come into fruition after Expo goes down. I'd like to just request if you would vote for Malaysia. We are competing against all the other countries, so please vote for Malaysia as one of the smallest but the touching the ground lightly and making an impact. I think that's the most important thing. So good luck to you for Osaka. Yeah, thank you.